Hi, everyone. Happy Saturday. Thanks for joining. So today we're going to be in the studio with a special guest interview, Nicole Wilson, who is the creator of the blog Tea For Me, Please. So we have a really exciting program coming up for you today. So just getting started first, a little bit of some updates and some announcements, because we do have some folks joining us today who are new, as well as some folks who it's their first time here and others who they watch our interviews a lot. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Suze. I'm the host of an online education program called Being Tea, and I host interviews as well as teach workshops every single month. And the workshops are available for members. You can find out more about membership at patreon.com/beingtea. That's where I host the workshops. There are new workshops every single month about various tea topics, such as functional skills, brewing, cupping, learning different origins, as well as training in tea meditation and tea mindfulness. So it's a nice balance and mixture of classes. So your support every month helps to make that possible, as well as to be able to host wonderful guest interviews like Nicole. So Nicole has been keeping her blog since 2008. And for which she has won several awards and recognition in the industry. So she's a really influential voice in tea, and someone I'm really happy to have here today. So I'm going to invite her up on screen. Nicole also happens to be a member of the Being Tea program and supports tea education. And she also works with me on the Specialty Tea Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization that helps serve the needs of small tea businesses and independent folks working in tea. So welcome, Nicole. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
How are you today?
I'm good.
What tea are you having?
I am drinking a pour tea called Daydream from Crimson Lotus Tea.
I love Crimson Lotus.
Yeah, they're awesome.
Their teas are so cool.
Not gonna lie, I totally bought it because the wrapper of that tea is my spirit animal.
Oh,
it's
so
like
awesome.
A girl sitting in a teapot like it's a hot tub, and I'm like, I'm her. So.
I know. I really love people who bring their personality to their tea line that they're creating, whether it's the names or it's the artwork. I love that trend. I think that that's a really it's important because it shows people why you're interested in tea and what you have to offer to the discussion and why you're here. And yeah,
definitely. What are you drinking today?
I am drinking this really cool Vietnamese white tea that I picked up earlier this spring. It's really, the coloring is very striking. It's kind of like that moonlight white color where there's really, really dark darks and really bright whites. And it smells just really nice. Very fresh, very honey toned. It's awesome.
Sounds great.
So let's see. How do we start this? First question I guess I would have is, so you've been doing this for over 10 years. What are some of the major consistent things that you have noticed change in not only the type of content that you write and what you're interested in writing, but what your readership asks for?
I would definitely say there's been a huge change. I know for me, when I first started, I started off with flavored teas, lots of blended things. And that was kind of where my audience was at that time too. But there's a progression in tea that, if you keep drinking it, I find you kind of go the other way and start drinking more straight teas, unflavored teas. And that's kind of how I feel like my audience has kind of changed with me as well over the course of those years. And the industry has changed a lot in that sense as well. When I first started, it was kind of like everybody was buying the same teas from the same main big distributors. I even would have multiple companies send me the same exact tea to be reviewed, where there's a lot more direct sourcing now. That really anything that I'm writing about on my blog now is something that person went to origin and sourced directly themselves, or directly from, a producer, that, compared to, having all these like the supply chain that, you're not entirely sure where the tea came from. It's definitely a huge change on that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When you started and you mentioned like that you were writing about a lot of blends and flavored teas and such like that, was that, did you have a sense that that is what people around would be most interested in reading? Or is that kind of like a reflection of where you were at and you were writing more about what was relevant for you?
A little bit of both. When I first started, I really started the blog because I was reviewing teas for a website called tviews.com. And they were basically sending me a lot of flavored teas. So that was a big part of it because I was basically just kind of republishing my content from their site as a way of backing it up. And then basically, looking at my, beginning SEO and all that, at that time, all of my search traffic was coming from David's Tea, Fruity Tooty, whatever, that was kind of how people were finding my blogs. So for a while, I did feel like that's what I had to write about, even if I did want to write about other things, because that was what was bringing people to the website. But that's changed a lot, definitely.
How did you make that transition? Like, that's something that I think about a lot in my work, just as, prior to starting my own company just to focus on education, I worked for a number of large tea companies in roles that were really specific to like their audience and what they wanted to tell. And making that transition to, what I'm going to write about and teach to what I think is important is something that I found really refreshing, but you have to do gradually. And I'm just curious. I always like to know how people transition to including their own voice more and more, so that it's not alienating to people and you're not really taking a huge risk that could just shut people off, but you are being more honest to yourself.
Definitely. And that was a big part of, I was trying to figure out how can I make this what I want, what I'm passionate about, but also make sure everyone comes along with me too. So I started, basically I try to publish 3 times a week. And I kind of instituted Monday as like the education day. So rather than reviewing a tea, I would write a post that was educational, so that people who were just starting out could get this information that they really weren't able to find easily. Like you would have to read lots of books and do tons of research just to find something that could be easily explained in like a short blog post. So that's kind of, starting to help them really understand tea, and everything that goes into it. And then just kind of sprinkling things in more, like alternating between flavored teas and unflavored teas. And then just eventually kind of just focusing more and more on the teas that I was interested in and that I wanted to promote.
I really like your review policy too. Like you talk about, on your website that you're not just a place for people to send every single thing. Like you're getting more and more curated about what you want to talk about. And not only is that just a reflection of your time and how much you have time for, but where you want to try to highlight the best of what's coming about. How did you develop the review policy over time?
A lot of it just became almost like, I would get these emails that I'm like, why are you asking me this? So then I just started, adding to the review policy as time went on. A lot of it was just, I was getting buried in tea, which sounds wonderful, and it is, but at the same time, I would feel so guilty because like they're sending me all of this tea and I don't have time to get to any of it, and I don't even like some of what's being sent to me. And so I just realized that I really had to become much more picky about what I was agreeing to accept, as something to review on the blog, because you want it to be something that you're going to enjoy. You shouldn't force yourself to, drink these things just because somebody thinks you should. And so that,
not like paying for that, like that, like that's
exactly. And that's the thing is it's a lot of work to run a blog, but it's not something that, especially a tea blog, you're really not going to make money from a tea blog. So I had to realize like my time was so limited that I wanted to spend it doing what I love instead of just slogging through things.
Was there a period where that overwhelm was like, how did you manage the period of the overwhelm?
You know what? I at the time I actually wound up, I was publishing multiple times a day, like 7 days a week.
Oh, wow.
I was a tea machine. My moment of overwhelm actually came last year. I was getting married and I changed jobs, and it was just such a period of transition, and I had so much going on in my life outside of tea that I really didn't have time for anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, at that time, I just was like manically drinking tea and writing about it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you, I know you're obviously, in order to get where you're at, you're really knowledgeable about SEO and things like that. Did any of your research show that you need to publish every day, or is that just sort of like what you felt you needed to do? Because now you're 3 times a week, and that seems so much more balanced.
At the time, a lot of the gurus or whatever were saying, you know, publish as much content as you can. And at the time, that was kind of what Google wanted. So Google does change what they're looking for at different times too. Now their algorithm is so focused on quality and solving problems for people that it's totally different than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's interesting because, like, you know, when I started the online program last year, you may remember, like, I was doing 4 workshops a month, and that was just a lot. Like, in hindsight, I like that I have that content now. But at the time, I'm thinking, like, okay, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is, you know, a member who's just interested and they like reading and, you know, things like that about tea. But taking that many classes a month was just like, no way anybody would want to do that, even like as a professional. And I was like, oh, maybe I don't need to overwhelm with so much. And so now it's 2. Now it's like on average 2 and some other special features. But yeah, like the idea that more is always better is changing in a lot of industries. What are the when you were writing a lot more, like as frequently as that, did you have categories for types of content you were developing, or was it just kind of stream of consciousness? Like how did you create all that content?
At first it was mostly stream of consciousness. It was just, you know, whatever I felt like writing, I would put out. And then that was kind of part of like, you know, optimizing for SEO and things like that, all of the guides I read had recommended kind of putting things into content buckets that like to make it easier for people to look through what you have. And especially, you know, after 10 years, I have almost 2,000 blog posts. So it's a lot. So it really helps people to separate it into, you know, if they want reviews, they can go right to reviews. If they want things that are more educational, they can go right to that. I find it's really helpful for visitors to do that.
Are there areas that you don't like writing about as much? And not that like you like that, I guess it's more challenging in some sort of way. Either that's the time or it's the research or just kind of like the mental energy. Like what takes the most for you that is kind of like
I would say for me, honestly, reviews are partly because I've been doing it for so long. It's kind of a chore-like exercise compared to something that's, you know, writing a post that's helping somebody learn something. It's something I'm much more passionate about doing. Even if I love the tea that I'm writing about, actually getting it into a blog post that I think people would enjoy and that, like, you know, ticks off all the boxes that you're supposed to tick off. You know, that takes a lot more energy and effort for me. That sometimes I can just sit down at the computer and slam down 1,000 words without even thinking about it when it's, you know, teaching somebody something that I know is useful and that I'm really passionate about.
What are some of those boxes that you keep in mind for like a good tea review?
So definitely there's all the stuff for Google that, you know, you want to make sure that you're over so many words. You want to, you know, I try to cover all the bases of, you know, I tend not to like flowery descriptions. Like I tell you what the tea tastes like, but I'm not going to go into all these like effusive things because that's just not how I approach tea.
Thank you for that. Like it's unnecessary.
There are some people that write that way, and I love watching other people write that way, but that's just not how I can do it.
Sometimes it just goes on and on.
Yeah,
and on.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
Scrolling by and you're like, like it's just most obscure aromas and fruits and foods, and I'm just like, no.
Exactly, yeah. But it does take a lot of just trying to figure out how to help you understand my experience of this tea, but also not being, you know, like you want to be unbiased in a way that just because a tea isn't for me doesn't mean it's not for you. So I, you know, definitely trying to make sure I'm not being overly harsh or critical when it's not like something that's genuinely bad. If something's genuinely bad, I usually won't write about it.
Yeah, I
life
was
is
going
too
to
short
ask
to
you about
waste on
that.
bad tea.
Right,
It's,
right.
I'll gently let a company know, if I do feel like that it's really a bad example. But yeah, I usually, and sometimes people will have a hard time with that like they think you're being paid, or like they're accusing you of being like, that you're trying to promote a certain company. But it's really just, why would I spend my time focusing on a tea that I don't like and I don't think is good, and that you shouldn't drink it either? There's so much good tea out there.
Have you had any instances with a company where they've been receptive to the negative feedback? Like it was helpful for them to know that?
I definitely have had a few cases. Yeah. Like, they'll definitely, maybe even just reconsider. Sometimes it's even just how they sent the tea. Sometimes they'll just
Right.
send it in an envelope in a Ziploc baggie and it gets crushed to hell before it gets to me. Then I'm like, maybe you should treat your tea with a little more care. It is hard though, because a lot of companies already have an expectation of what they think will happen, and if that's not what happens, they have a hard time sometimes.
And I think also, yeah, you bring up a good point about just the packaging. Like sample packaging is one of those things that over many years has been really bothersome to me, because it is the customer's first impression of something, and especially if it's the official sample package that you would use to send it out, not just I put it in this for you because it's a small quantity, but this is how you actually send it out. And when, like the tea goes stale in there and it's not proper sealing, or it gets crushed, or just whatever, like sample packaging it's the area that I think gets the least attention, but arguably should get so much more.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely times where I get a package of samples and I'm like so wowed and impressed that I'm in love with them before I even tried the tea. But, which helps always. But yeah, there's definitely times where I'm like, what are you doing with this tea?
So what do you like writing about the most? What would you like to transition to writing about more?
For me, it's definitely just, like really education on tea. A big part of it for me is, there's definitely great books out there, but there's not really a place that I find focuses on everything. Like the tea world is so diverse, and no matter what, if you're somebody who's writing a book, you're going to come at it from your perspective. But there's, if somebody's interested in Japanese tea, I'll recommend this book. If somebody's interested in pour, I'll recommend this book. But it's almost like, almost wanting to be like a compendium, that it's just like not super, exhaustive coverage, but just enough that if somebody's looking for that information, they'll at least have a place to, like a jumping board to go off of.
And actually, you bring up a really good point I was going to ask you about. So the one of the biggest transitions I've noticed in the industry is this move towards specialization. And it affects so many things. It affects the menus that folks are curating, and the type of teas and tea wares they're selling, but it also affects our writing. It affects how we share information and how we make recommendations. So how did that transition play out for you? Both as just like the observer and writing about what's reflecting in the marketplace, but as well as what you personally contribute. Like you say, you recommend a book on pour or a book on Japanese tea. And so that's a reflection of the idea that all of it is not just this one company or this group of companies, but now it's lots of small players who, well, that's where they were born. That's just what they do. And yeah, they should be the authority to speak to that.
Exactly. And I find, especially, in comparison to when I first started the blog, the level of quality has really gone up. Because of the specialization trend, that, when you're a generalist and you send me a sencha, that's your one and only sencha, that you're just like, it's from Japan. And that's really all you know about it. Where if you are a Japanese tea specialist who has 30 different senchas and you're like, this is Yabukita and it's from Yame, and like that you can give me all of those granular things, I learn more about the tea, and I find that you do get a higher quality product because they know what they're selling,
How do you think consumers manage all of this new information? Like, how do they make it? How do they organize that and keep it absorbable?
It's really overwhelming for new people. It definitely is. I would say it's really the online tea community is really a huge part of it. It's almost like we're all educating each other. That just by sharing information and helping each other learn, that's really how I find everybody's kind of absorbing and digesting all of this information. Because you can tell somebody all of these things and they don't necessarily know what they mean. So it's really, I find it's super helpful that just, I'll post something on Instagram and it kind of connects a dot for somebody, that even if it's just like a small thing in my captions, it's like, oh, I didn't know that. And it just like, you just connect those dots over time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How do you, when you're deciding how you're going to create your content for any given period of time, how do you manage the voice of writing to someone who is just starting out, as well as for somebody who has been at this a long time so that they still find something for them?
So I find for me, I love getting nerdy. I really do, especially when it comes to tea. But I love doing it in a way that's really, you don't want to get too lost in the jargon, because really that doesn't help anybody. You just feel fancy for using all these words, where if you really break it down into simpler terms, even if you're telling the same story, then that then becomes useful for both people who consider themselves connoisseurs and then people who also are just starting out and really are super new to all of that.
Mm-hmm. I find too that the getting nerdy with folks, if you can do it in a way that's really playful and in a way that's light and it's not so serious, because then it makes it seem like there's a much more reasonable bar for entry.
That's exactly it.
That.
Yeah, it's really, at the end of the day, it's just leaves and water, and we all love it. But you can't get so serious about it that you lose the fun in it too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you consider yourself an educator in the industry?
I think so.
Mm-hmm. Was there a point where you started to realize you were more comfortable saying that?
Yeah, it definitely. I would say honestly, probably the first time I was nominated for the World Tea Award, I was just like, wait, what? I didn't really see myself that way. But then realizing people nominated me for this award, that I was like, that must mean something to them. That was kind of what made me take that step back of no matter what, you're your own worst critic, and we all do something and you're like, oh, that was terrible. But no, somebody else is not going to think that. So yeah, I think that was a big turning point for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I asked the question just because I think, it's of all the various roles that there are in the tea industry, education, I think, plays some important part in a lot of them. If you work retail sales, if you're a wholesale sales director, if you're working in the blending room, education has some part of that. And I always find it really nice when people own that and they feel like they're comfortable saying, yeah, I educate. I'm not just this job and this is the only function I do. And it doesn't have that kind of same responsibility as being a fully just, that's all you do is education. I mean, we all have that responsibility, right?
I think so. Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of that has changed as well. That, when I first started writing, people were like, oh, you write a tea blog? Even in the industry, they're like, why do I have to talk to you? There was this attitude of they didn't understand what a blogger does. They didn't understand, how they could possibly benefit from that. And it's totally changed. World Tea Expo this year, people were like, oh, you're a blogger? They were so excited to talk to any of us. That it's really been a total change, but they see the value that we give to the consumers because we're educating their consumer and helping their consumer understand the product.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that a little bit more, actually? Because that's a really good point. What that was like interfacing with the industry in a time where being a writer, being a blogger was just really not as respected. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one of my first, they had World Tea East in Philadelphia for a few years, which was supposed to be a micro World Tea Expo. And I had never been to World Tea Expo, so I was so excited. And I had vendors that, like, when I went up to the booth and they saw my press pass, they literally turned away. That they were like, it's a waste of my time to talk to you because you're not going to buy my product. Which at the time, you know, they're all wholesalers. So I kind of saw where they were coming from. But at the same time, I'm like, we're all promoting tea. You need more people to drink tea. So, you know, but it's been a huge transition that, you know, there's so many vendors that really, I don't know, they help to promote bloggers as much as they can, even if it's not about their own product, because they know that there's a huge education gap in tea. That, you know, especially in America, you have your people that drink tea bag and you have your people that drink really good tea. And there's not a whole lot of in between. And I feel like bloggers are kind of the bridge for that. That, you know, we help them make that transition. That, you know, if they're like, I like drinking tea, let me, you know, search around and see what's going on. That, you know, that's what helps get them to the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that has been a really positive trend of just valuing education a lot more and understanding how to value it. It's still something that I run into relatively frequently, you know, even after all these years, just that people don't quite understand what an educator does or a trainer, and how that is specifically something that they can interact with in their industry, in their business. It's like when you're meeting businesses and they're a little not sure, like, what the value proposition is here, or what the interaction is like. How do you describe, especially like in the example you gave, like a wholesale person, right? So for me, the interaction of what the wholesale customer would be, well, I train your staff so that they can educate your customers, right? If they don't feel that they can pass on that knowledge, you're going to have uninspired customers who may buy your product for a while, but then afterward, they're going to switch to somebody else who has more to offer. So what's the value proposition that you give when someone's like, I don't get it?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say awareness is just a huge part of it, that consumers, that's how they find out about what tea they want to buy. If they say, you know, I want to buy a Dongding Oolong, you know, if they don't know where to start, they're going to start looking at who's writing about tea. And so they say, well, you know, Nicole says that this one was, you know, tastes like this, and I think that sounds really good. And that's kind of how they'll get their feet wet. That, you know, once they're, you know, they lose their training wheels and they get more into tea, they'll be able to make those decisions themselves. But when you're first starting out, it's unbelievably overwhelming to figure out where to get a particular tea, or even what you're looking for. That, you know, I find blogs are kind of where that happens.
Mm-hmm. And actually, yeah. So for folks who are kind of struggling to just get started and even know what they're looking for, what's a easy suggestion that you would make for them, as far as just Google this? This is the search term you need to search, because it ends up getting lost in the Amazon post.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'll even do it like tea review and then what you're looking for. That generally will bring up kind of whatever you're looking for. That, you know, I mean, you might have to go through a couple of pages on Google, but generally you will find a blog somewhere, even if it's an older one. You know, some of the blogs that when I first started, they're no longer producing content, but their content still exists. That even if it's not a current blogger, you can still benefit from what they wrote years ago. Mm-hmm.
How do you, as someone who, when you're learning about tea and researching for content, how do you filter and manage stuff that's significantly older? Because as a professional, you know, like, you're aware of that things change, but I often meet a lot of new folks who have no idea that something that is even just 10 years old might not be the most relevant source. And they don't quite understand exactly why and how to filter that better.
And that's a super difficult thing, because there's so much stuff that was repeated verbatim over and over again in the tea world that we all thought was true. And
white tea has no caffeine.
White tea is not oxidized. Yeah, like there's just so many things like that we now know aren't true. And for me, I just try to get as many different perspectives on something as I can. So that I can compare and contrast and kind of mash them all together, to try to get to like the real like center of what something is. because it is really difficult. That, I had, and a lot of my inspiration for different blog posts comes from things like that. I had somebody who had that old chart of this leaf is the Souchong, this leaf is, and so they were convinced that all lapsang Souchong is bad because that's the bottom leaf on this diagram. And I was just like, no. So but then that inspired a blog post that would then help other people, because I was able to, put all this information in there to help them understand why that was a misconception and why it was something we believed and why it's no longer true.
Mm-hmm. Is it ever difficult for you to provide that context and that kind of course correction in a way that's not trying to make anybody feel bad about either having believed that or having taught that themselves, but you do need to kind of correct things?
Generally not. I find, because I do approach things from kind of an educator mindset. I used to be a Girl Scout leader, so I find that's kind of how I approach things. Because of that I think of if I had a kid that was in that same situation, that you would guide them in a way that wasn't mean or making them feel like they're less than or anything like that, but helping them kind of get to where they needed to be on some things. So I find that's, especially for tea, if you approach it in a negative way like that, it's just going to make them say, well, maybe I just don't drink tea then. That doesn't help anybody at the end of the day.
Right. They shut down. Even if what you're saying is valuable, it's just coming from such a negative space that they sense that and they pick up on it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's transition a little bit to our other topic we really wanted to talk about today. You alluded to it a little bit earlier, and that is the this really large umbrella of what we would call transparency in tea. And it's a word that is affecting not only just tea, but it also, of course, affects our friends in the coffee industry, in the sense of not only just coffee, it's pretty well documented where it comes from, but the price that's paid for it is really what's causing a big crisis in their industry right now. And with tea, we have such a complex issue with transparency, and not all of it is, it's not to say that it's a problem because there's been deception necessarily. I mean, in some cases, yes, but generally it's just a function of how it works. Like you mentioned before, teas that are supplied by the same wholesalers and just kind of get sold and resold, that's just how stuff has worked. It's just, it comes in big containers and then is broken apart and sold. And even from the people who are on the supplying end of it, the discussion is a little strange for them. I've met folks who were like, why would you, I can't tell you the exact person who made this. That's just not how this works. So talk a little bit about your feelings on where you think this needs to go. Why is this such an important issue to at least address?
Definitely. I think a big part of it is helping companies understand that that's what consumers want. I find a lot of parallels with the wine industry in the US. 30 years ago, people knew there was red wine and they knew there was white wine, and that's about all they knew. And it's changed tremendously since then, that people now know about terroir. They know about different grape varieties and things like that. Where with tea, they just know it's tea. And so we're kind of at that point where we have to help consumers differentiate, because otherwise they're going to be drinking commodity tea bags that are, 2 cents a serving, that are not helping the place where that tea is made. And they're also not helping the consumer, because they're not getting, everything that they could possibly be getting out of tea. It is a fine line though, because like you said, not every person is going to be able to tell you who, the name of the person that made the tea. And then you have the flip side of that, they could totally be making it up and you would have no idea. They could put some name that they're like, that sounds like a tea farmer, and a name of some guy from a stock image, and they would, be able to promote that as tea, that they're buying, which I'm sure can and does happen. So it's kind of you have to just really be fair and balanced about it, that you have to, understand that there are supply chains in place, and they're in place for a reason, but that also to, vote with your wallet, that like, if you want tea that you want to know more about where it's from, then that's who you should buy it from. Where the companies that are not necessarily deceptive, but they're not, they're just like, this is green tea. They don't tell you where it's from. They don't tell you anything about it. Then, you should, as a consumer, make that decision and decide what you value in your purchase.
Mm-hmm. For anybody who might be a little bit newer to the term, can you explain like how you would the difference between like commodity and specialty? What does that mean?
So for me, specialty is whole leaf. That's kind of especially because the industry is so new and there's so many variables. If really most of what you would find in a tea bag is not going to be what would be considered specialty tea. Yes, there are specialty tea companies that might put theirs in like the fancy pyramid bags, but that's totally different than like, say, what you would find on your grocery store shelf.
That's a packaging.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. For me, it's more if you just look at the leaf, that you can really tell, for specialty tea, it's going to be much more whole. You can actually see that there's leaves and not just, crumped up bits. That's kind of like the big differentiator for me. Because it is hard though, because you still there's teas in India and Kenya that may have more of an appearance like that, but that are made, in a way that is more of a specialty tea. So there's not like a black and white definition that you can give it, which is tough.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, especially or anybody who is kind of in an industry where they serve that existing market need. I think of, for example, like a lot of teas from Nepal, like quite a lot of them in the really fine specialty market are that like stylish whole leaf. But then there's some that are the more broken, because that serves that's the bread and butter of their business. That's just what they mostly sell, is to companies that make large blends and things like that. And so they are still, this is where I think consumers can get confused. As a producer, they would still be considered like a top line specialty producer. You can name them, like, where it comes from, how they're treating their garden and their land, how they're treating their workers, the types of companies they typically do business with, but their product that they produce can be in two different buckets. And I think that's kind of hard for people to wrap their heads around.
It is. Yeah. Like it's easy to just kind of like, broadly say, if it's not this fancy full leaf tea, it's bad, which isn't the case at all. So it is difficult. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I find that is a really dangerous assumption that sometimes people make, is like, especially they're wondering how literal you get with the whole leaf.
Exactly.
Like if it's this size or if it's this size, and if it's little small ones, then that's bad. And I think really the conversation we're having is about the origin, where it came from, the transparency of that.
That's more of what I think everyone is looking for now, is, we want to know where the tea came from. Last week, I just out of curiosity, occasionally I go through my grocery store in the tea aisle and I look, and there's maybe one box in the whole aisle that tells you where the tea actually came from. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you look at all of the rest of the food in the supermarket, the bananas come from Colombia, everything else tells you where it's from.
At least the country.
Exactly. Except for tea, that it just says tea. It'll say orange pico but that's all it will tell you. And it's not helpful for consumers to sell the tea that way, because they don't see value in it if there's no information given at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really great qualifier for that, because I was just wondering, like, how do you, because I get into this conversation sometimes with folks, how do you get people to be interested, to want to care about that as an issue, if they don't see the relevancy of how that affects them? Like, it's not just that you want to know all the details about which slope of the mountain that came from and how many meters high and stuff, because all of that, to a certain extent, it can be a bit it's a bit trivial. Like you're just memorizing details about a tea, and it doesn't really directly affect your taste, in the cup unless you understand how it does. So then why is the information important? And it's important, as you say, because it demonstrates value of something, that it's an individual person or a farm that made that, and it's giving value to that as opposed to making a generic product like, heck, even our sugar, we know where sugar comes from.
Exactly, yeah.
We can't even point to that and say like, oh, it's a staple like sugar or pepper. No, we know where that comes from too.
Definitely.
We have a question from one of our viewers asking, how do blends fit into this definition of specialty?
I actually think blends really do fit into specialty tea. There's a real art to doing it, especially if you do it well. There's a lot of bad blends out there, but there's a lot that are so thoughtfully constructed, and and there's even teas that you don't realize that are blended. That even something like if you buy a pour cake, a lot of the times that's going to be a blend that person designed to be pressed into that cake. So to say that blends are bad is kind of a really difficult thing for me, because there's so many different levels even within that, and
so a lot of Japanese teas inherently are blended.
And yeah, exactly. That there's teas that you don't even realize are blended that are. And so, there's a fine line, because if you add so much flavoring and dried fruit and yada yadas until it's not even recognizable as tea, that's hard for me, because it's not really tea anymore. It's like a tea flavored beverage, maybe. But yeah, it's kind of like transparency that, there's not a clear distinction, but you have to understand all these different levels,
Yeah, I think understanding the levels and the ramifications for the levels is a really helpful position to stand. Because, for example, like transparency, knowing where it came from and who made it and things like that, what the data was harvested, even, it's not it doesn't always guarantee quality.
Exactly.
It really doesn't. Like it's not so, and that's kind of a really curious thing for people to wrap their head around too, is that like, well, if it doesn't guarantee quality, why should I care?
Mm-hmm.
And you should care because we care about the entirety of our food supply chain. We care about not only for safety reasons where something came from, but we care about the ethics of knowing that line of where something came from and how people were treated along the way and the conditions in which it was grown. That's why we care. But at the end of the day, yes, I could have a tea from somebody that literally made it themselves in their own garden, and honestly, it's terrible. And I can also have one that is from a company that it's not like a commodity dealer, but it's somebody who would just say like, this is, Dragon Well from Zhejiang, and that's, it's all we know, but it's still really quite good. Because somewhere on the back end, maybe they have more information and they're just not sharing it yet with their customers. But yeah, it's not always, the information itself does not always guarantee the quality.
Exactly. Like the tea I'm drinking today, the Daydream from Crimson Lotus Tea, it's a blend that they made. So yes, we know it's from Yunnan, but you really don't have any other information about the tea because it's something that they custom blended themselves, which doesn't mean that they're being deceptive. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It's just, it is, that's specific to this tea. And it's really getting to know the vendor, I find, instead of focusing on like, well, I want to know what mountain this tea is from. Like, it doesn't help you necessarily to know what mountain the tea is from, where if you, follow them and that every year they go to Yunnan and they post videos where they're in these gardens and they really show what they're about as a company. I find that's transparency for me, rather than, all these check boxes that you think they should be revealing. Yes, there's things that you want to look for that might be red flags. But I think that's really where I look is the company itself and how they operate, and, rather than focusing on, this pour should be from Iwu or somewhere else,
I 100% agree with that. And I tell people that that's kind of one of the, it's a little bit difficult because it does involve effort on your part to get to know a company and start researching them. But honestly, that's that's the point. Like you're looking for the vendor relationship and somebody you trust, because at the end of the day, like I wouldn't ask a master baker to reveal their recipe for how they make their croissants, right? But if you tell me the ingredients and they're whole and I can pronounce them, and maybe you disclose the farms that you buy like your grain from or your dairy or things like that tells me that you really give a damn about your croissants that you're making.
Exactly.
And the quality's there. So I'm much more likely to have your product and really enjoy it and frequent you as a customer.
That's definitely it. And I find I shop that way for things that aren't tea. So it's just like a natural transition to, for that to bleed into my tea as well. And I find that that's been a big part of the transition in the tea industry as well, is that, people care about what they eat now. They care about what they eat came from. That, all of those health trends filter down into the tea world eventually. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think hands down, that's one of the things that's really driving it and helping it to make sense to customers, because we approach this with so many other things. I mean, the first time, like any bakery I'm visiting, that's one of the first things I start looking at is the ingredients in it and where they're getting it from, because there's a lot of stupid bakeries out there. There's a lot of stuff that just it just tastes bad. It tastes stale. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, you could tell the flour's old and, they're using like old oils instead of butter and just things like that. There's just stuff that's not nice. Right. And so I really want to find the ones where it's handmade, it's the old style techniques. Maybe you're using sourdough to make their bread, all that stuff. Like, I want to find that because I care about the artistry of food. And so if we start viewing tea as like a food, then we should care about the artistry of tea.
Exactly.
How would you, when you're talking about transparency, especially like in an industry setting, like we're at World Tea Expo, and then you have some of these really large vendors who are there, the ones that do the wholesaling. How do you make that a sensitive conversation for them when they may not be in the position where they can, for whatever reason, like they can't reveal all of their supply chain? How do you make that so that that's something that you think they can participate in to some degree without like threatening the supporting of their business?
That's a tough one. I think on the wholesale end, it is really hard because I think helping them understand that they will help their customers sell the product, that, if the consumers are looking for particular information, then the tea shops and restaurants and places that they're selling the tea to need that information to be able to share. I find, especially like at World Tea Expo, some people are like surprised that we want that information. I'll definitely have conversations that they're like, they're like, oh, we didn't even think that somebody would want to know that. That I think it's helping them understand that those conversations are there and that will help people, connect to their product, both in the, for their wholesale customers and on the consumer end.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Like I've even had those conversations with suppliers in Asia who are surprised that people would want to know that. Like that's even like, it goes kind of against their own way of how they, have put together things and how they source and maintain privacy of customer information and things like that. They're surprised. Like they totally are about the promotion of tea education, but for them, that's more like this education, like the result of when you actually get it and how you use it and the culture, but they don't necessarily view the supply chain as part of that education. And it really is. And that's surprising for people to view that that's part of education. Definitely.
I had a conversation with a vendor just about a clay teapot. That, they kind of sold it as, the typical like mystical clay that, comes from these ancient mines and yada, yada, yada. And so they were like, what did you think of the pot? And I was like, it was fine. I was like, but just kind of telling them that I'm like, but it's not like, it's modern clay. And they were like, wait, like, about that? And I'm like, yeah, that it didn't dawn on them to tell customers that information because they thought that you wouldn't even know what to do with it. That they were like, it wasn't an intentional malicious thing. They were just like, oh, we didn't know that people in the West knew about the Asian clay mines that, And I think a lot of that it goes to tea as well, that they just don't think you need or want that information or that it would have any context for you. So like, why share something that's not going to be helpful is kind of how they approach it, I think.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think I've encountered some of that too, where like there's an element of surprise that the culture is as evolved as it is here. For as much as, you know, we, especially tea fans in the US might kind of romanticize heavily the idea of like, I want to go and just live on a tea farm in China, and that's the only real way to have tea. Like, I've always said that I feel the US truly is one of the best places to learn about tea because we drink all tea. We love all of it. We are curious eaters and tasters, and we love learning about stuff. And so rather than just being in a vacuum where all we have is Japanese tea or, you know, like Indian tea or whatever, like we just know what's in our own immediate community, we care about all of it. So it means that there's a lot to juggle, but that also means it's a big stage that can hold a lot. And I think that's really cool. We have to see that as a positive rather than as something that is, oh, we're just a bunch of generic tea drinkers and we don't care, because that's not true.
No, I definitely see it that way. You know, they call America the melting pot, and I see our tea culture that way because we didn't have one. So instead we're just borrowing from everybody.
Yeah. I think actually, you know, think about that question of how we make things a little bit more inclusive for the wholesalers. I think actually one of the answers is something that you touched on earlier, is even just the effort of showing you interacting with your suppliers. It doesn't have to be literally point for point every single tea, because that's not the point. We just want to get a sense for like how you are at origin. Honestly, like, are you a jackass to your people and not pay them? Or are you like, is it a long-term relationship where they are mutually in business with you and you're not cheating them, and you know, you care about quality and you're engaged with them for their voice on what the quality is? That's just what we really want to know.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the root of it, that, you know, you don't have to give away all of your secrets. You just have to show us, you know, what your values are as a company and how you know, buy your tea and, you know, how, like you said, how you're interacting at origin. You know, that, you know, are you just sending one guy who's just buying kilos of things without even looking at them?
And
you know, there's
photos and
exactly.
Selfies in the garden and that's enough. Like,
that's
not enough. But I like that idea of just showing how you are as a business and demonstrating your values, because I feel like that's something that if someone were so inclined to want to take to a marketing firm and really talk about, that's some deep work, is how you demonstrate your values. What do you tangibly do that demonstrates your values, that is a real takeaway from the consumer and not just lip service, right? Not just data.
Exactly.
Awesome. Any final thoughts about like the transparency discussion? Like what's the takeaway, I think, for a consumer who is trying to be more mindful about where they're getting their tea? What are some easy things that you point them in the direction of when there's that big question of like, well, I want to care more and I want to be more mindful, so what should I look for?
I would say I definitely look for, my big thing is I want to know when the tea was harvested. That's something that a lot of companies don't tell you. And as a consumer, you have no idea how old what you're getting is. It could have been sitting in a warehouse for years and you would have no idea. That I find I very rarely will purchase a tea that doesn't reveal that, because that's not something that should be hidden. You know, I should know if it was a 2018 tea, if it was a 2019 tea, if it was a 2016 tea. You know, and I think that at least country of origin, you know,
oh God. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, or, you know, there's all these like little granular things like elevation that like some people will give you. It's not necessarily something that you can use as a barometer for quality. That I think it's important to, you know, realize that and say like, yes, it's great when they give that information, but it's not super necessary or, you know, indicative of the tea itself. Yeah, But yeah, I would say definitely just origin and kind of when the tea was harvested, because as for a consumer, especially if you're first starting out, those are the things that are really going to make a difference for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would love to see companies more comfortable with sharing the harvest date, because I feel like we need to work also to dispel this myth that everything has to be within like a month of when it was picked or it's not good. Right.
Yes.
Because customers they have no idea of how a tea ages and what its average shelf life is and how you extend that. So if you're selling, green teas right now and you have some in stock that are 2019 and you also have 2018, I don't care. That's okay. Just tell me. Like
exactly.
if you're selling the 2018 now, and the description that you provide for it is accurate, because, a lot of teas will age really nicely, right? And so I will trust you more as a customer if you're upfront with that, rather than me having to play the guessing game.
Absolutely.
And if you're a good tea company, you shouldn't have stuff that's like 4 years old that you're selling if it's not meant to be aged, right? So exactly. I would expect like a vendor to have a mix of teas right now, especially because it's August, and just knowing that if people are shipping by standard ocean shipping, right, their teas are just now coming in. So I would reasonably expect that you probably have a mix of some things that you flew in that are 2019, as well as a mix of some things that are still from last year because the fresh shipment hasn't arrived. And that's okay, as long as you're open about it.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're truly educating people about the process of buying tea. And most people have no idea what that's like.
Absolutely. And I find too, especially for consumers, last year's harvest is a great way to get good tea for less. That, you're going to pay a premium if it's, Dragon Ball that was harvested before Tomb Day 2019, that it's like, you can drink 2018s and it's going to be just fine, especially if you're so new to it that you really almost would miss the subtleties in a super new, super fresh green tea.
Yeah. It's like it has to mature a little bit and settle out, exactly. Like very few teas are really good immediately after, like express fully what they have to offer in like immediately. You kind of want them to settle a bit.
Definitely.
And I love companies that have the promo sales on last year's harvest when they have the new stuff coming in, because that provides such a great opportunity to do comparative tasting.
Absolutely,
so you could do some really nerdy stuff when you pick up last year's, especially when it's from the same producer, and compare it to this year's and learn how a tea changes over the course of a year.
Yeah, I really love doing that too.
Awesome. Anything else that you'd like to share as we wrap up?
I would just say to everybody, drink lots of tea. Like, people tend to, we're creatures of habit, and you get into this, like, this is what I like, so that's what I'm going to drink. That there's so much to explore. Like, don't limit yourself, because there's so much out there that, never stop trying new teas, because there's always something new to try and explore.
Actually, yeah, that's something I was going to ask you. So what type of tea do you think you drink the least of? And how do you encourage yourself to remember that, it's been a while since I've had that and I should probably drink more of it?
I would say probably green tea. A lot of it is, I don't get a lot of it sent to me unless it's like right when the first spring harvest comes out. So like April and May, I'll get lots of companies that are like, here's the new Dragon Well, here's the new Sencha. But then after that, I tend to not get any green tea, which is, it's kind of one of those, I'm like, I forget how much I love it, because I'm so busy drinking all of the oolong and the pour that people are sending me later in the year, that I'm like, that when I circle back and I'm like, this is really good, that I do forget how much I love green tea.
So please send Nicole green tea, especially if it's good green tea. Come on.
Yes.
Come on, guys. Like, seriously. Well, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your knowledge and what you've learned through interacting with the industry in a really special way that you do, like being that advocate and being that person who is, trying to from a position where like you're not hired by a brand to do a specific thing, like you're just here for the tea, and that's really special and that's really rare.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for what you do. Your classes are really, great. And there's really not something else out there for consumers that are so, accessible, but, really educational. And it's not like this, pay this many dollars and take the Skype class and call yourself a tea master. It's just like genuine learning about tea, which I love.
Yeah, I mean, like I think you and I perhaps approach our tea learning in a similar way in that I've both been through certification courses as well have developed content for them. There is value in that, yes, but there's also value in just how do you just have tea in your life all day, every day? How do you keep that interest alive and how do you keep that learning alive? And you do it through not making things about a point A to point B checklist of what's in between and crossing all the dots and then saying, okay, I'm done. Because you're never done. And
exactly.
It has something that inspires you to want to keep going.
And that's what I love about tea is that there is no end point, that it's, 10 years later, I'm still learning new things every day.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're able to see cycles too. Like you're writing about categories of teas and origins and types of processing and specific harvests that, like you're writing about teas, like when you think about first flush, for example, it only happens once a year, right? It's called the first flush. You get one shot. Exactly. And so you basically have only reviewed first flush 10 times.
Yeah.
That's it. Like that's a handful, right? And I've only ever worked with first flush teas for like a handful of times over my years, right? Like I could say I've been working in tea for 16 years. That's 16 times I have interacted directly with first flush. That's not a lot. So there's so much room that we can keep doing more, but we have to think of how do we interact with it all day, every day. And that's what I just love about what you do, because you keep that alive.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Thank you everyone for watching and for tuning in. And I hope to see you back again on one of our interviews sometime soon. We have a special one coming up in September that I'm so excited about, and I can't wait to tell you guys about. I haven't announced yet who it is, but I'm like, but meantime, if you're interested to learn more about classes, get in touch with me directly at hello@beingtea.com. And you can also check out classes on patreon.com/beingtea and get more involved with your tea. Thank you again, Nicole, so much.
You're welcome.
See you. Talk to you again sometime soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, everyone.